Ladies and gentlemen, since January of this year, more than 18,000 people were expelled from Germany. Nevertheless, this will not become a record year because in 1984, more than 50,000 people were expelled from the country. Nonetheless, I would like to explain to you today that the experience of mass expulsions is not only a sole experience of the 20th or 21st century, but that it is rather a historical experience, and that as early as in the 19th century, there were mass expulsions from Germany. And the first mass expulsion from Germany was directed against the Poles and the Jews. While this event or this experience has almost been completely forgotten, it is still being cultivated and preserved in Poland. And most of all, it is instrumentalized by nationalist parties in order to propagate an anti-German and German hostile image. And this expulsion of the Poles, this the term given to this mass deportation, is associated in Poland with the Pickelhaube, the spiked Pickelhaube helmet. In Germany, there are different associations with the spiked helmet, different than from Poland. While to many Germans it represents the discipline, the strength and order of the Prussian state, for Poles it recalls the repressive policies implemented under Bismarck. Let me say a few words about the historical background. By the 18th century, at the latest, Prussia had embarked on an expansionist course towards neighboring Poland. In addition, it was in fact the three partitions of Poland into three parts that paved the way for Prussia's emergence as one of Europe's great powers. So the Prussian territory increased threefold. After the dismantling of the multi-ethnic Polish state at the hands of Prussia, Russia and Austria, the mostly Catholic Poles, along with Polish Jews, made up more than a third of Prussia's total population, which is frequently forgotten, by the way. In many parts of the newly annexed eastern provinces, such as West Prussia and Poznan, these groups even formed the majority. This is what you can see the precise areas here on the map. The new provinces, marked by ethnic, cultural and religious diversity, posed a challenge to the Prussian leadership. It was not only a mere territory. Their heterogeneity stood in contrast to the clear, orderly vision of a German nation-state. This was hardly possible. Prussia planned to integrate, therefore, these regions by strengthening German influence, a trend that became particularly evident after the founding of the German Empire by Bismarck. The policy of the so-called Ostkolonialisation, the colonization of the East, was a response to the pressing Polish question. It sought to systematically reduce Polish influence and to integrate the eastern provinces once and for all into the German national order. Prussia employed a range of strategies to achieve greater cultural and ethnic homogeneity. Unlike traditional colonial ventures, which involved the domination of distant overseas territories, the goal of internal colonization was to reshape Prussia's domestic population. I do not wish to be misunderstood. For me, this is not the same, of course, colonialization and internal colonization, but there were different discourses in the 19th century about colonization, and one of those discourses was directed against the eastern neighbors. So a range of strategies was employed in order to achieve this, as I just mentioned. Prussian Prime Minister and at the same time German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, as part of his Kulturkampf, culture struggle, aimed to suppress both the Polish language and the Catholic Church, because the Polish language and the Catholic Church were identification factors for the Polish nation. A central pillar of the Germanization policy was the nationalist and racially motivated anti-Slavism, rooted in a belief in German cultural and biological superiority and in long-established notions of the barbaric East as a hostile other. You may look at this image, though the Germans were considered as bearers of culture since the time of the German order. This racist rhetoric directed at the East was also used to legitimize the widespread hostility towards Jews in the German Empire. A virulent wave of anti-Semitism in the 1880s was fueled by historian Heinrich von Treitschke, who, in his known essay Unsere Aussichten, Our Prospects, described Jews as a host of hustling, pants-peddling youths who year after year poured across Germany's eastern border from the inexhaustible Polish cradle. Their descendancy would one day command Germany's stock exchanges and newspapers. His essay ends with the infamous line, "The Jews are our misfortune." End of quote. The image of a flood of Jewish immigrants from the East figured prominently in the Berlin anti-Semitism debate or dispute. Unfortunately, I do not possess any pictures or images from that time. They date back to the 19th century, Simplicissimos, and also a postcard, which, by the way, is part of the Deutsches Historisches Museum's collection. You can see that the Polonization of West Prussia, so the immigration of Polish Jews into the West Prussian province was huge. So it was feared that they could be the only ones to speak German, and there was also the accusation that they could reproduce as rabbits. So the result was a wave of emigration. 677 Jewish immigrants who had originally come from Russian or Austrian-ruled parts of Poland were expelled. This was more than the total number expelled from the 4 eastern provinces combined, which deported 662 Jewish immigrants in the same period. So in the time between October 1883 and October 1884. The so-called menacing flood imagery must be seen in the broader context of the long-standing hostility towards Poles in Prussia. The expulsion of Jewish immigrants in 1884, derisively called, by the way, Überläufer, infiltrators or defectors. This represented the culmination of the aggressive anti-Polish policies that Bismarck had been systematically implementing since the 1870s. Why so many people immigrated into the eastern provinces? This was due to the fact that these Austrian or Russian regions were most of all agricultural regions, and many peasants, farmers lost their livelihoods, and these regions were not industrialized regions. And there was also the anti-Semitism wave in the 1880s in Russia after the assassination of Tsar Alexander in 1881. Most of them continued to immigrate into Poland, but many remained in the eastern Prussian provinces. And this intersection of imperial colonial ambitions with national aspirations in Prussian German politics, as I said, became particularly evident in 1884 to 1885. Here are some book titles where you see again the term of internal colonialism directed decisively against eastern neighbors. At the so-called Congo Conference in Berlin, where the expansion of the German Empire was to be driven forward, the Prussian government ordered decisive measures to be taken against the increasing Polonization of its eastern provinces. Contrary to Bismarck's intentions, the culture struggle, the Kulturkampf, had led to a sense of national identity among the Polish-speaking population and intensified their political resistance. This, by the way, is also to be seen in the context of a higher birth rate among the Poles. In an effort to end the dominance of the Polish element and to weaken Polish national resistance, Bismarck, on December 15th, 1884, instructed his interior minister to deny naturalization to any Poles originally from the Russian partition who were living and working in Prussia. So their naturalization was denied. But Bismarck's decision came as no surprise to contemporaries and sparked discussions about Germany's so-called strength as a colonial power, its power of colonization. The philosopher Eduard von Hartmann, the philosopher of the unconscious, was a vocal opponent of the policy, expressing his concerns in an article about the decline of Germandom, or Germanness, both within and beyond the 1885 borders of the German Empire. While Bismarck attempted to position Germany as a formidable imperial power at the Berlin Conference, or Congo Conference as it was called, Hartmann cautioned that the German people were at risk of losing their innate power of colonization. This is why, he argued, and I quote, "We must Germanize our imperial territory and secure the absolute dominance of Germany in our homeland. If the Slavs seek to eradicate Germandom within their borders, we must retaliate by eradicating Slavdom within ours, lest the influence of Germandom significantly declines in the history of civilized nations." End of quote. Hartmann's calls for the eradication of Slavdom had little in common with the Nazis' later policy of extermination, but as you can see here, the concept of creating living space in the East was not an invention of the Nazis. There were many reprisal measures, and this is why in February 1885 a decision was made to carry out mass expulsions. So this is the anniversary this year. 1 week after the end of the Berlin Conference, the order was issued, I quote, "to undertake the comprehensive expulsion of all Russian subjects residing in Prussian territory in any capacity other than as travelers." End of quote. In mid-March, Bismarck sent a message to Moscow, declaring his government's intent to expel all Polish Catholics and Jews who had immigrated from Russia. Of the roughly 30,000 people affected, around 2,600 lived in Berlin. Berlin, which at the time had a population of 1.5 million. That was the number of its inhabitants. From July 1895, Prussia began deporting immigrants from Austria-Hungary too, in addition to those from Russia. All in all, around 32,000 people. A third were Jews. An estimated 75% of Polish immigrants in Prussia's eastern provinces faced deportation. Some had lived in Prussia for several generations, while others were not even aware of their legal status as Überläufer or infiltrators. Those subjects to expulsion included women born in Prussia who had lost their citizenship through marriage to Poles from Russian-controlled Poland. Now I would like to talk about the reactions to those expulsions in the international press. The expulsion of Poles received, yes, coverage in the press throughout Europe, but responses to it varied significantly. The harshest criticism came, obviously, from France. France, where the news of deportations was used for propaganda purposes to reinforce the idea of Germany as a hostile power. In Germany, no political party offered unanimous political support for these expulsions, not even the German Conservative Party, whose Eastern landowning members largely opposed the measure, albeit not publicly. Of course, those were German noblemen who lost their lands. Here are two caricatures from the socialist press publication. Those cartoons deal critically with the expulsions of Poles. Not even the Vatican or the Catholic Church reacted to the expulsions with criticism. No. The thing that was astonishing for me, that even German Jews, they kept a low profile. They didn't advocate for those expelled. A majority of those Jews viewed Jewish immigration from the East with skepticism. They approved the expulsions. Why? To Jewish assimilationists, so they were proponents of assimilation. So to these Jewish assimilationists, then these newcomers represented the religious culture, represented a culture that they believed they had left behind them, and they saw it as an antithesis of modern enlightened German culture. The expulsion of Poles in 1885, was not merely a political action, it was a manifestation of internal colonization, driven by imperialist nationalism, ethnic and racial marginalization, and increasing state control. It intensified economic, social, and political conflicts in Prussia's eastern provinces and laid the foundations for hostilities and national myth-making. Unlike in Germany, where the expulsions were quickly forgotten or deliberately suppressed, in Poland, however, they fueled a powerful anti-German narrative that found expression in literature and historiography. Just months after Bismarck's dismissal in 1890, the eastern border was nonetheless reopened to migrant Polish laborers. But the legacy of those Prussian expulsions continued to strain German-Polish relations for decades to come. And here are two examples. This is a caricature about which depicts a classroom of a German school. There is the German translation of a poem that you see here. All those among you who went to school, those who went to school before the fall of the wall had to learn this by heart. This is about Germanization of Poles. And the other one was written around 1900. It makes also reference to the expulsions, about historical paintings. If I'm not mistaken, there's one image that is part of the collection of this museum. You see the spiked helmet again here. Today, in the meantime, interest in the topic has declined markedly in Poland. Really, I looked for it intensely, but I only found these two images. This is a book about the problems with the Germans, and another caricature on the right-hand side, which depicts the German dominance in Europe. So the topic of expulsions of Poles doesn't play a role anymore. And just the last sentence, at the German-Polish border, there are intensive controls again at the border. People with a swarthy complexion are expelled, both by the Poles and by the Germans. At the moment, currently. It is astonishing for me that neither the Polish side nor the German side of the border recalls those historical events. This is a symbolic policy because this is only about very few people, and it's once again it's about nationalism. There is a sharp turn to the right in Europe, in my view. Thank you very much for your attention.